Some smiles are loud. They enter a room before the body does. They flicker with ease, and fade just as quietly. But somewhere between the practiced grace of that smile and the silence of night, something gentle fractures. Because not every smile is joy. Some are shields. Some are apologies. Some are simply the language of survival. There are people who have learned to smile the way others learned to disappear. Perfectly. Politely. Without leaving a trace of what they are truly carrying. And the world praises them for it. For their calm. For their kindness. For never being too much. But what remains unseen is how heavy it is to keep becoming smaller so others can remain comfortable. How lonely it feels to be admired for a version of yourself that doesn't include your real ache. This is not the story of sadness. It is the quiet story of emotional invisibility. Of being present, yet profoundly unseen. Of smiling, while slowly fading inside. Chapter 1. The Smile as a Mask. A polite smile is rarely loud. It does not announce pain. It does not ask questions. It does not take up space. It arrives gently, and disappears just as cleanly. To the world, it looks like ease. Like confidence. Like a life untouched by heaviness. But beneath that expression lives something unnamed. Because some people do not smile to be kind. They smile to be safe. It is easier, after all, to be pleasant than to be honest. Easier to smooth the edges of feeling than to explain the weight of it. Easier to offer warmth than to reveal the quiet cold that has settled inside. Loneliness does not always look like isolation. Sometimes it wears perfume. Sometimes it wears humor. Sometimes it wears a calm voice and immaculate manners. And this kind of loneliness is the most invisible. It does not come from being alone. It comes from being unseen. From being emotionally present, yet never truly met. There are those who have become fluent in emotional hospitality. Always listening. Always understanding. Always holding space. But never being offered any. The polite smile becomes the entrance fee into connection. A silent agreement to never introduce the parts that ache. Never burden the room with honesty. And over time, the self becomes edited. Trimmed. Oftened. Not for expression, but for acceptance. Because somewhere along the way, the world taught them that being too real would make them harder to love. That heaviness must be hidden. That vulnerability is inconvenient. So the smile became a translation device. The pain, converted into charm. The tiredness, filtered into kindness. The longing, rebranded as independence. And everyone applauds how well they carry it. Chapter 2. Where silence. Loneliness often begins long before the polite smile appears. It grows quietly, in the small, overlooked corners of childhood. In homes where emotions were inconvenient. Where questions went unanswered. Where needs were delayed or dismissed. Children are experts in adaptation. They learn the language of survival long before they know the language of self. If love arrives conditionally, they learn to shrink. To speak softly. To vanish into the background. To be easy to be around. It is not malice that shapes them, but necessity. A child quickly understands that the world rewards calm compliance and punishes raw feeling. And in response, a silent contract is formed. Feel less. Show less. Ask less. The adult they become carries these early lessons like invisible armor. The polite smile is inherited from a younger self who had no choice but to protect their heart. It is an echo of countless quiet compromises. And yet, even as they grow, the lesson remains alive. The desire to be seen is filtered through caution. Vulnerability is suspicious. Emotional exposure is risky. So they smile politely, as they once had to, because it has always been the safest language they know. A way to belong without asking too much. A way to navigate a world that rewarded silence before it could be understood. Chapter 3. What the? The mind is not indifferent to pain. It is devoted to survival. And it learns quickly which emotions are safe to show, and which must remain hidden. When someone smiles through loneliness, It is often the result of an ancient wiring. The nervous system has learned that discomfort should be contained. Fear, sadness, and longing are folded into invisible compartments. They are catalogued and stored, safely out of sight. The body becomes an ally in concealment, muscles trained to speak charm while the heart whispers exhaustion. Psychology calls this emotional suppression. Neuroscience explains it as a defense mechanism. The brain prioritizes social harmony over internal authenticity. Cortisol rises quietly, stress accumulates subtly, and the body adapts to constant tension as if it were normal. But the cost is invisible to the outside observer. The smile remains polite, unbroken. The laugh is timed perfectly. The conversation is fluid. Yet beneath the surface, the nervous system remains alert. Loneliness pulses in quiet rhythms. Even small interactions can trigger a deep fatigue, an internal whisper that says, "You cannot be fully seen. You cannot be fully known." And the paradox is profound. The very mechanism that keeps them safe from rejection also keeps them trapped in isolation. The polite smile is both shield and cell. A protective gesture that ensures survival, while quietly deepening the sense of being unseen. Chapter 4: The Inner. Inside there is a quiet tension. A gentle tug-of-war between the self that is presented and the self that is lived. The polite smile walks through the day carrying a carefully curated version of identity, while the unseen self waits, unnoticed, for acknowledgement. This divide is subtle. It does not always erupt in visible conflict. It lingers in small moments, a sigh behind closed doors, a hollow laugh, a glance that never meets the eyes of another. The inner self whispers truths that the outer self cannot risk revealing. It longs for intimacy, yet retreats at the first sign of potential rejection. Living this way is exhausting. Energy is spent not only in outward interactions but also in the constant editing of inner reality. Emotion becomes a landscape of compartmentalized feelings, love, grief, joy, all filtered through the lens of acceptability. Loneliness grows here, not because the world is absent, but because the self is fragmented. Even in crowded rooms, the internal witness observes silently, separated from the external performance. Recognition of this divide can awaken a mixture of grief and clarity, grief for the years spent hidden, clarity in seeing the invisible architecture of survival. And sometimes, in the rare moments when no one is watching, the polite smile falters. A flicker of the true self appears, fragile, tender, real. It is in these moments that awareness begins to take root. That the quiet loneliness has always lived between the lines of the smile. Chapter 5: The Moment. Awareness often arrives gently, almost imperceptibly. It does not announce itself with grandeur. It comes in a quiet shift, a pause in routine, a lingering thought, a glance that catches something previously overlooked. For the person behind the polite smile, this moment can feel fragile. It is the instant when the weight of constant self-monitoring becomes visible to themselves. A subtle grief rises, not for the world, but for the years spent performing, adapting, and shrinking. They notice, perhaps for the first time, the spaces left empty inside. Softening begins when one allows the inner gaze to linger without judgment. Noticing the ache without trying to fix it. Acknowledging the fatigue without shame. Feeling the loneliness without fear. It is here that small truths emerge. That safety is not only external, but internal. That vulnerability, long feared as dangerous, can be approached gently, in measured breaths. And that authenticity is not necessarily loud or dramatic. It can be quiet, patient, and compassionate. This moment is not a sudden transformation. It is a quiet invitation. An opening of the heart that allows a tiny space for honesty. For recognition. For connection with oneself that was missing. And this softening, the first cracks appear in the invisible walls. The polite smile does not vanish, but it begins to shift, less armor, more reflection. A beginning, subtle and profound, of seeing oneself without needing approval. Chapter 6: Relearning. To feel fully is to relearn a language once taken for granted. The heart remembers what the mind had long suppressed. Breath by breath, moment by moment, presence is rebuilt, not as a performance, but as homecoming. For someone who has lived behind a polite smile, this process is delicate. Safety must be rediscovered in the body, in the mind, and in relationships that allow space for authenticity. It begins with small gestures, pausing to notice sensations, acknowledging thoughts without judgment, permitting emotion to rise and fall naturally. Loneliness softens when it is met, not ignored. When tears are allowed to flow in quiet rooms. When laughter comes unprompted. When silence is not a punishment, but a companion. This is not self-improvement. It is self-return. A gentle reclaiming of parts that had been hidden or denied. It is learning that the world may still require politeness, but the heart need not always comply. That smiles can coexist with honesty. That presence can exist even in the midst of uncertainty. And as presence grows, the inner divide begins to shrink. The self that was performed and the self that was felt start to align. Loneliness loses some of its power, not because it disappears, but because it is recognized, named, and allowed to breathe alongside life. Chapter 7: A Smile That. A smile that breathes is no longer armor. It does not hide pain. It does not negotiate acceptance. It simply exists, light, fragile, honest. For someone who has carried loneliness behind politeness, this is a revelation. The smile becomes a reflection, not a shield. It curves gently across the face, carrying traces of sorrow, traces of hope, traces of self finally acknowledged. Moments of connection take on new weight. A conversation, a glance, a shared silence, all feel richer when the self is present, unedited. There is no need to perform warmth. It simply radiates from a heart that has been gently seen by itself. And yet, the transformation is quiet. It is not a declaration to the world, but a quiet unfolding within. A deep acknowledgement that being human includes contradiction, strength and fragility, solitude and belonging, sorrow and joy. This is the poetry of existence. The gentle rhythm of a life lived honestly. The acknowledgement that smiles can carry depth, not emptiness. That loneliness need not be eternal, if it is met with awareness. A smile that breathes does not erase the past. It honors it. It carries it. And it allows the self to step forward, softly, fully, finally seen.